यहाँ मौजूद दोस्तों में ज़्यादातर प्रोफेसर पाराग से परिचित हैं। एलेक्स उनके बारे में कुछ बताने की आवश्यकता नहीं। फिर भी हमारे बहुत सारे नौजवान दोस्त हैं जो दूसरे विषयों से हैं, इतिहास से अलग विषयों के। सिर्फ उनके लिए मैं एक बहुत संक्षिप्त परिचय प्रोफेसर पाराग का लेने जा रहा हूँ। उनका जन्म 1947 में हुआ और उन्होंने दिल्ली विश्वविद्यालय और कैम्ब्रिज में इतिहास की पढ़ाई की। फिर उन्होंने इंपीरियल रशियन हिस्ट्री में विशेषज्ञता हासिल की और यूनिवर्सिटी ऑफ ऑक्सफोर्ड से डीफिल की उपाधि हासिल की। सेंटर फॉर हिस्टोरिकल स्टडीज जवाहरलाल नेहरू विश्वविद्यालय में 1974 से 2004 तक उन्होंने अध्यापन किया। यूनिवर्सिटी ऑफ शिकागो में 2006 में वे इंपीरियल रशियन हिस्ट्री के विजिटिंग प्रोफेसर रहे। इंडियन इंस्टीट्यूट वाइन स्टडी शिमला वे 2010-11 में नेशनल फेलो रहे और नेहरू से उनका रिश्ता हम सबको पता है। नेहरू सीरीज, दूसरी नेहरू सीरीज के संपादन से जुड़ा हुआ है और इस सीरीज की खासियत यह है, जिसको देखकर हम जैसे लोगों का दिल खुश हुआ था, कि इसमें उन्होंने नेहरू ने जहाँ मूल हिंदुस्तानी में कोई भी बात कही है, कहीं भाषण दिया है, तो प्रोफेसर पाराग ने ये सुनिश्चित किया कि वह मूल हिंदुस्तानी वहाँ आए। वो पहले की सीरीज में आपको नहीं दिखाई पड़ेगा। तो ये सुसंपादित श्रृंखला नेहरू कार्य की है। प्रोफेसर नाम
Thank you very much, Professor Jawaharlal. The subject I've chosen for today is Nehru, the historian of home and the world. The reason I chose this, strangely enough, we have not paid enough attention to Nehru as a historian. Nehru wrote 4 big books of history. He thought it important to write history, although he was so immensely busy as a political leader at the time he wrote it, even long before he became Prime Minister. And we haven't adequately investigated why he chose to spend so much time and effort writing a history. He didn't do it as a pastime, he didn't do it because he had spare time in the jail, nothing else to do. He did it as an activity that is important to his politics. He saw it as necessary. Now, why did he see it so necessary? And why did he write so much that was what he considered necessary? It is a history of the world and of India, that is a point. So he considered that as the 2 focal points that we have to pay attention to. And the reason he wrote history is given in the Glimpses of World History, the big book, the second book he wrote, which is that whatever future we have in mind for ourselves, we have to ensure that the past has prepared it. Otherwise, we cannot attain that future. It is futile even to make an attempt. You cannot imagine a future because you like it. Then it is daydreaming. You can only imagine the future if you have prepared the past for it, or if you see that the past has prepared for it. Therefore, a serious study of history is part of your politics. You cannot engage in politics in a meaningful way unless you have studied your history and you know that it is possible and how it is going to be possible. That is the central point he made in the beginning of the Glimpses of World History. And the future he had in mind was that one humanity, one world. So he wrote his history to prepare for the possibility of thinking of the world as one. And he said, you cannot think of the world as one unless you can think of the past as one. The whole of humans, of the human species, is growing together and becoming one type. So he wrote in that spirit, and interestingly, he wrote the 2 world histories before he wrote the 2 Indian histories. I say 2 world histories. One is a glimpse of the world history. There's one before that, a very small one, Letters of a Father to His Daughter, which is the history of the world from the beginning of the universe, or from the beginning of the earth until the evolution of the human species until the middle of the first millennium. So he saw fit to write the history of the species before he got down to writing anything more. Now, the future that he had in mind is this, and that is why he was writing the history. It is a political act in itself to understand that history and to disseminate that to his audiences and his followers whom he hoped to lead into independence. And the model he chose, there was an available model, was H.G. Wells, The Outline of History, published the fourth edition as late as 1922. So it is all there, and he followed it fairly closely. But independently of the model, it is his central idea that drove him on. The Indian future that he had in mind was specified as consisting of really three elements. One, that India should be a democratic society. Two, that it should be socially harmonious. It should be secular, in other words, what we call now. The constant conflict between sects must come to an end. And there should be continuity in Indian history, continuity and unity. Now, all these he discovered in Indian history. The unity of Indian civilization, he declared, exists and has existed from Harappan times. That's an extraordinary claim to make. I think as a historian I would disagree very strongly, but he was making a statement, a political statement for the movement he was leading and for the nationalism he was building. That there is a unity and it has been continuous, and he makes a claim that Indians anywhere in India could feel at home in a way that they could not feel elsewhere in the world. But I do not know if that is acceptable and whether that is valid as a statement, but that is how he claimed it was. He was speaking as like a middle class professional of the 20th century and reaching back into history to make that claim. But it was necessary to make that claim in order to unify the country for the unity and independence and the future that he had in mind. And so he made it. It is a typical feature of all nationalists that they weave myths, and this was a myth that Nehru wove for the unification of the country. The other one was about the democracy of the country. Now, India was going to be a democracy, he was passionately committed to that. But the point is, you have to show that there is a historical past to it, or a possibility in Indian history. And he found it in village democracy in ancient India. So he chose to write about it in the glimpses and subsequently that in ancient India, up to about the year 1000 CE, there was a vibrant village democracy. It faded subsequently for a number of reasons, but it existed. And it can be revived, and that is a foundation on which the Panchayati Raj will be thereafter be created, about which he was so passionate in the course of his prime ministership. So that he did project a historical foundation for that democratic future that he was building up in India. He didn't say anything about parliamentary democracy, there was no democracy at the top, but at least there was at the base. And his constant refrain throughout his tenure as Prime Minister was that unless you have a democracy at the base, it is not secure at the top. And this is what he was securing. It was provided at the base in this form, and therefore it is going to be secure at the top. The parliamentary democracy is going to stay, if this was the case. So he provided one more foundation for the future. And the third one was, of course, communal harmony and all its problems. It was his claim that in ancient Indian villages there was such communal harmony, there was no doubt about it, and it was lost in the course of the centuries, sometime after 1000 AD. In both cases, both village democracy and communal harmony declined after 1000 AD sometime, and it was due to the villagers being so conscious about their autonomy, or so confident about their autonomy, that they left politics to their superiors in the major centers of power, and their autonomies were then encroached upon gradually in the course of the centuries until it faded away. And the conflict that we encountered in the 20th century was the latter-day creation that came in the course of those centuries, but especially in colonial times. So we have an ancient history of communal harmony, of continuity and unity of civilization, and of democracy and the foundations on which the future of India can be built. This is the purpose with which he was writing his history. It could be questioned in many ways, but this was his purpose. And with these two objectives, he set about it. Now, the next purpose of writing is to ask the question, what are the lessons we can learn from history? We always claim that there are lessons. Now, he was living in a time when it was said by everybody that there's no such thing as lessons you can learn from history because history never repeats itself. We are living in revolutionary times ever since the late 18th century, and revolution means it is not a repetitive cycle. Although the word revolution means repetition, revolution around the sun, but that's exactly what is the opposite meaning that we now have of revolution, that it is not repeated. And if human history is not going to be repeated, then how do we learn anything from the past? I mean, that is a conundrum he had to solve. He didn't set it out that way, he didn't set out to answer that particular philosophical problem, as it were. But he came up with an answer. There is one fundamental lesson we can learn through all of history, and he laid it out in the glimpses of world history, especially, and also in the discussion, but more so in the glimpses, which is that if you do not keep an open mind, you are doomed to civilizational decay in one way or the other. So your mind has to be always open, always flexible, always ready to accept stimuli from outside, and that is what will enable you to be constantly creative and capable of meeting every challenge that you might have to face now or in the future. And if that is the case, there is no question of decay at all. You cannot possibly do. You might be defeated in battle, technologically, militarily, economically, financially, and other resources might be superior on the other side, but it will not be an obliteration of your culture and civilizations as has happened in the course of history to a series of civilizations, be they Chinese or Iranian or Ottoman or Arab or Roman or any number of Indian ones. That did not happen. So as long as you keep that open, you're okay. This is the central lesson that he drew. Now, the problem about this, of course, is that he claimed that history does not repeat itself, yet he also said that it does repeat. This is a repetition, that you keep on declining if you fail to keep an open mind. He was enamored of the idea of the possibility of a science of human nature, which positivists from the 19th century have tried to discover or formulate. People like August Comte and John Stuart Mill and their followers in the 20th century. But they haven't succeeded, of course, and historians do not accept it because human beings are not subject to personal laws of individual laws of behavior. They can always violate any law that you might choose to propose. Biological laws, yes, but not laws of action. That you can never predict, and therefore history can never be predicted in this way. So, nonetheless, he came up with this, and he came up with a history of this repetition of the possibility of decline. Now, he brought these two concerns, the future that you must have in mind, and his future was a one humanity, and therefore the history of the whole of humanity, and an open mind. And the two came together, they fused. As long as the mind is open, there's a perpetual process of osmosis taking place between cultures, between civilizations, between any kinds of groups. That interpenetration will constantly fertilize the mind. Not merely fertilize it, it leads to the unity of the human species. It has to, because you're constantly borrowing, you're being stimulated by external forces constantly. You can never close yourself off. So the fact of an open mind leads to a united humanity, and that is exactly the history that he's writing. So he's drawn the two lessons, although he's drawn the main lesson of history: to keep the open mind, you will be secure, and the purpose of it is to lead up to a united world, united species altogether. So cultivating a global consciousness is an essential aspect of this whole process, and he was so global in his consciousness. He was a nationalist who was internationalist. He prided himself on that, he constantly advocated it, and he never compromised on both. He was a proper nationalist, a nationalist who united the country, an internationalist who transcended that unity into a major political undertaking, and wrote the history accordingly. So it was with these questions in mind that he wrote his histories. And his first book, Letters of a Father to His Daughter, published in 1929, which has come out in a nice, handsome edition from Penguin, I think, is a charming book for a 10-year-old girl about the history of the world from the origins until the middle of the millennium, first millennium. Now it goes through all the process of evolution, and he brings all his concerns about unity. I will not elaborate too much on that, except to point out one thing. You remember in the 1920s and 30s, race was such an important issue. It had become a primary matter in European politics, and racism was not confined to Germany and the Nazis. It was a pan-European phenomenon. The whole of European imperialism was based upon a racist theory about a hierarchy of genetically programmed people, so that there are superior and inferior races. That is something he adamantly denied and dismissed out of hand, and he explained that races are entirely environmentally determined. There are different races that are identified by physical characteristics, but there is an environmentally determined feature. And he went on to languages, so that it showed the common sources of many languages, but it did not presume to suggest that there's one language for the whole species. He didn't reach that point. But the curious point about this book is that it finishes in the middle of the first millennium, fair enough, but it finishes with India. So it's as if the human evolution is culminating in India. It's very flattering for us, but it's rather curious to see it in him. But it is rather parochial on his part. It's not something you'd expect from him. But more than that, it culminates in the coming of the Aryans, Vedic and Sanskrit culture and so on, the epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, and the occupation of what he calls Aryavarta, that is northern India, and the pushing of the Dravidians into the southern triangle of the subcontinent. And the Dravidians more or less have only a look at it from the margins. It seems an astonishingly provincial version of Indian nationalism, which is rather surprising again from a man like him. It's not what you'd expect. And what is surprising is that it has come, and he's placed it at the moment when there's something else happening in the world that will suited his global consciousness very much. That is the appearance of a series of very influential philosophies which survive to this day. That is of the Upanishads, of Buddha and Mahavira here, of Lao Tse and Confucius, of Zarathustra in Iran, the Jewish prophets in Palestine, and the Greek philosophers. They're coming together, bunched together in those few centuries. In the middle of the first millennium has been called by Karl Jaspers the Axial Age. It has been disputed, of course, by many scholars, but it has also found a lot of traction. How did so many people come together, such influential philosophies come together, in those few centuries, that they have lasted so long? How did it happen? Is one of those somewhat mysterious phenomena of human history. Now, Nehru could have really culminated there. That is ideally suited for him, in a sense, to pronounce on the Axial Age, in so which he ended up in a rather banal fashion in Aryan India, in the way he did it. Anyway, that's only the introductory thing. When he got on to the glimpses of world history, he, in a sense, corrected many of those things, you might say. He laid out fully what is the meaning of a future, a common future for everybody. And he showed it right through, again and again, with the rise and fall of civilizations and how it happens. Now, the lessons of history is what he drew from that rise and fall, which I've already suggested. If they don't keep an open mind, this is what will happen to them. And he takes you through all the famous declines. The book is, in a sense, obsessed with decline. That is almost a central theme of the book. Why do civilizations decline? And he takes you through the Roman, the Ottoman, the Arab, you name it, the lot. Iranian he hardly touches, the Chinese very much, and of course in India. He takes you through all of them. And again he comes to exactly the same conclusion. They declined because they closed their minds. And the moment that happens, however brilliant of achievement you're never going to survive. And you'll be overtaken and destroyed by whoever it is. The Caliphate by the Mongols, the Romans by the Goths, the Chinese by whoever, each one of them, one after the other, and so on. But the curious part of this is, if they are constantly declining due to this reason, and he's writing his entire history, we find ourselves with the same cause, the same explanation for the decline of every civilization throughout human history. So about 5,000 years of human history, 4,000, whichever you choose, has exactly the same explanation. They all decline for the same reason. Now this is not at all what a historian would ever do. This is not what you call a historical explanation. A historical explanation is about unique events, and the causes are very specific to that event. You cannot have the same explanation for the decline of the Roman Empire, the Chinese Empire, the Arabs and the Iranians and the Indians and so on. Because that's not. There is no longer an explanation. So in other words, he's not writing history at all, when he gave the same explanation right across the board throughout the centuries. He was, in fact, preaching. It was a sermon. It was a homily on good conduct. How to be a creative human being and how to be a creative culture. And if you wish to be that, this is what you must do. Otherwise, this is a cautionary tale of what is going to happen to you in the future if you fail to observe these rules. This is what he was writing. So it is not history. And there's one reason why I would say D.D. Goswami actually said there is no explanation for history in his books. He made that grievance. And I think validly so. It is not historical explanations that he gave us. Although there's a lot of good narrative history in it, but there's no historical explanation, because it's exactly the same explanation right through. Now, given that, it's interesting to see what the inclusions and exclusions are. Like he's writing a world history, you can never write the whole of it. It's impossible. We all have to choose. And you can expect what he chose. He chose what are the centers of world power, which had world empires, and how they shaped the course of human culture. So, pre-colonial America is almost entirely excluded because of their isolation. Mexico does get a look in, the Aztecs. Africa is almost entirely out, although he has such a deep engagement with Africa as Prime Minister, and otherwise he was one of the foremost exponents of the decolonizing and supporters of it right through. But there's nothing about Africa in the glimpses. Similarly, the other enormous omission, here I have a grievance, was Imperial Russia. There's nothing at all there. Well, I'm not surprised. He considered Russia to be such a backward and odious state that it gave way to the Russian Revolution, what we call the Russian Revolution, and then the Soviet state. About the Soviet state he had a lot, the revolution and the state. But about Imperial Russia, nothing at all. About Central Asia, again, nothing. And one of the reasons I can see is that he had a negative opinion of the Turks from Central Asia, especially those who came into India. He considered them as semi-civilized compared to the Arabs. So about them, almost nothing. So all these are missing. And the Ottoman Empire, he sees it almost perpetually as decline. He's hardly got anything about it, but whatever he says about it is only decline. But now this is surprising. The Ottoman Empire was in existence for some 7 centuries. It was a very major empire with a huge expanse of territory in Europe, Asia and Africa. And it is a successor to the Byzantine Empire, so you can see it as a continuation of the Eastern Roman Empire. But he has nothing much to say. And even the greatest event in the Ottoman history, which is the capture of Constantinople in 1453, he sees as the beginning of the decline of the Ottoman Empire, because they entered into the decadence of the Byzantine Empire from that date. So the triumph is actually a disaster, as far as he's concerned, for the Ottomans. And thereafter, except for the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, which finished in 1566, the rest is all decline. So decline, decline, decline. He could have almost written a companion volume to Gibbon after that. But I think the principal reason he doesn't care for the Ottoman Empire is that the Ottomans are the oppressors and the overlords of the Arabs. And the Arabs in the 20th century he had a soft corner for. He expected great things from Arab nationalism as an anti-colonial force and as a future unification of the Arab peoples. And it was because he expected so much that the Ottoman Empire he saw as just a precursor to British imperialism in the region, and therefore he paid little attention to it. The ones that he did pay a lot of attention to are the Soviet Union. That's expected, you might say, because of the industrialization planning in the 1930s, besides the revolution beforehand. China and Southeast Asia, and most of all, the Arabs of the Caliphate, ending with the Abbasid Caliphate. Now, the Chinese case, he is immensely admiring of China, but chiefly of the Tang Empire, which finishes in the 10th century AD. Thereafter, it is only decline, 9 centuries of decline, or 10 centuries. Despite the Mongol Empire, which is a considered disaster by nationalist Chinese at that time, but it created a great empire of its own. Kublai Khan is considered the emperor of China, but he's a Mongol emperor based in China. But it was followed by the Ming and the Qing empires, considered the greatest achievements of Chinese national history, and Qing certainly in the 19th century. But all these he considers as, in some way, stationary and stagnant and heading towards decline. The evening of the culture, as he calls it. The beautiful, wonderful autumn, he said. It is nice to see, but you know it is ending. The night is drawing to it, descending upon us. Expressed it poetically, but he saw it always decline. The one that he saw as brilliant in everywhere was the Arab culture of the early phase until the 10th century. And then it's a court of Harun al-Rashid, as you can imagine, that caught his fancy, because it was a place which was the most open, which had absorbed Greek philosophy in such a way, much more than the Romans had, as far as he was concerned. And it represented the best of the civilizational values of that region. It was that what he advocated was. That is one reason he said, if only the Arabs had come to India, it would have been so much better than if the Central Asian Turks had come. This was the culture he admired the most. But they also declined for exactly the same reasons. There's nothing much more to it. But he has a special and a soft corner for Southeast Asia. Now this is interesting, and it is rather different from everything else he has said. Southeast Asia, for one reason, is important simply because he wants to counter the British colonial historiography, which sees India as imprisoned within the subcontinent and is never going out. And he wanted to show that Indians actually went out of the subcontinent, fared far and wide, created empires, colonized and engaged in military expeditions, trade, sent out religious missionaries to these areas and so on. So that's one reason. And the other reason he wanted to dilate upon Southeast Asia was to counter the claim that it was traditional in India not to cross the waters, the Kalapani superstition. This is something he made much of throughout his tenure as Prime Minister. In practically every second speech, he brought up this issue. That Indians were stagnant because they refused to go out and refused to absorb anything from abroad. And this Kalapani is brought up as a metaphor again and again. And he wanted to show that that is not the case in traditional India. That they actually went out, they crossed the oceans, and created major cultures and empires and disseminated their civilization and philosophy over a very, very wide area, finally. So, with these two motivations, he went into the subject in a big way. And he traced the histories of this area from about the 1st century AD until the 16th century, the colonial conquest, when India was dominant, or he sees it as India's domination, with China, partially. Now the interesting part is he speaks as a nationalist, expansionist Indian, which is very unusual. Within India, he abhors that kind of nationalism. We might even call it chauvinism in some senses. That you can think of expansion as something so very laudatory. But he presented India from the Pallava dynasty in the 2nd century establishing itself through colonization and military expeditions in Southeast Asia. And that being maintained right through in various different ways, even the Cholas went later. For the first few centuries, it was Hinduism which dominated, and thereafter Buddhism took over. Both Hinduism and Buddhism he sees as Indian. He doesn't question whether Buddhism actually was Indian, which came to Southeast Asia. It could come from many other sources. It doesn't have to be Indian. But that is how he saw it. So to the rather exceptional aspect of Nehru that we see here, somewhat expansionist, I hesitate to say imperialist, but there's a tendency that way. He was casting India in the same way as European nationalists cast their empire building around the world. Otherwise, he saw nationalism as strictly a force for unification and the expansion of imperialism. Here, he's taking pride in India's expansion into these areas and dominating these areas. And most of all, you hear nothing about the local people. It's all about Indian culture and Indian and Chinese culture. What happened to local people, you might ask? So exactly what the Europeans were doing to India through Orientalism, in a sense he was doing to Southeast Asia, which is unusual. And there's one more feature about it, which is strange. He takes pride or dilates upon militarism. The empire of Shailendra, a brilliant warrior hero he was, and the empire of Sri Vijaya and so on. Nehru was not a militarist at all. He despised it, he disliked it. He said Alexander and Caesar were petty people. Yeah, he is no hero of his own. He said that about Alexander. But about this, he was prepared to go to some lengths to study the military conquests and achievements of the place. So these are unusual aspects. This is in part due to the Greater India Society, which was flourishing in Calcutta in those days with contributions from Rabindranath Tagore, which talked about precisely these forms of expansion, and much of it was quite chauvinistic also. But Nehru allowed himself to be drawn into the stream in this manner, which was rather unlike him in many ways. So the kind of nationalism that we see of him within India is not what you see when it comes to Southeast Asia. As he writes about the histories of rise and fall of so many civilizations, one after the other, he comes to very close to what we now call, what was then called also, civilization theory. Civilization theory posits the idea that the human society is divided into a series of discrete civilizations, 12, 13, 14, whatever it is. They calculate these and say that they are all like organisms which have a history of rise, of germination, rise and decline, exactly like organisms do. So they trace all the histories of the civilizations throughout in this manner. And the famous exponents of this, Danielewski in Russia, the Eurasianists who were Russian emigres in the 1920s, Oswald Spengler wrote the book Decline of the West, Arnold Toynbee, who has troubled us with 14 full volumes of it, called A Study of History, and subsequently Lev Gumilyov, again in Russia. You can see in Russia it is a very popular theory. And after the end of the Cold War, Samuel Huntington in America and Alexander Dugin again in Russia. So it is academically considered very disreputable, this whole set of arguments in this kind of theory, but it is popular otherwise. Now, Nehru did not adopt civilization theory. He did not say that there are discrete civilizations, and never once said that they rise and fall like an organism, although he traced the rises and falls of various civilizations. And he detested Oswald Spengler also as a man who spewed hatred and violence in society, in human culture. But he came close to it. It was, as it were, the manner in which human history was written in those days, not nowadays. And he had a companion in none less than Subhash Chandra Bose, who is intellectually one of the most ablest companions, who wrote a similar account of the rise of civilization, that he foresaw the rise of Indian civilization as a result of that kind of a theory in the course of this national struggle. He used Flinders Petrie, the Egyptologist, as his source of inspiration for disseminating such theories. So much for the civilization theory, which comes to an end in the 16th century. He's not a civilization theorist, but very close to it, shall I say. Now, in the 16th century begins the rise of Europe, and thereafter it's a rise of Europe. So he naturally spends a lot of time on the rise. Now, we would expect to see from him an explanation as to why Europe was able to rise the way it did and come to dominate the world the way it did. But he doesn't give us an explanation, doesn't give us a reason. And we can't blame him for it. Historians haven't been able to come to a conclusion as to why it happened. They have made various suggestions which have all been inadequate or absurd. They could be racist theories, they could be climatic theories, they could be just narrative histories of the previous and the antecedents of the Renaissance and the Reformation, claims to the legacies of the Roman Empire and Greek philosophy, and so on. But none of those are adequate, and some of the best historians have tried and have not come up with any explanations. People like Emanuel Wallerstein, after a full career of writing about these things, have said it must be a sort of a bright idea of the ruling classes. And a person like Eric Hobsbawm, who wrote about the Industrial Revolution, he said there's no particular explanation other than that all the elements fell together at that time, and therefore it happened. So there are no explanations for some of the most important things that happened in the rise of history. It happened. And that itself gives us a clue as to why it is so revolutionary and why it is not specifically European, that we'll come to in a moment. But this is the story he gave about Europe. Now, when he turns to Indian history, the big question is, as I've already said, is about civilizational continuity, and he declared it as a matter of faith. There is a continuity, and it has to be accepted. It's a broad statement. There is no empirical investigation or attempt even at doing so. On the question of democracy, it is about villages having it from ancient times, and it having vanished in the course of the centuries after 1000 AD. Now, the point is, the villagers seem to be so indifferent, as I said, and therefore they lost it to the sultans and finally to the British. But that is how it went. This is the point he was trying to claim. However much he saw the village as democratic, however, he was not so naive as to accept it fully. He saw it was bound to be dominated by caste and class. That actually what passed as village democracy is likely to be a caste oligarchy that was ruling it. And that came back to haunt him when he was setting up the panchayats and so on, with the fear that this is exactly what is going to happen. And Ambedkar reminded him of just that possibility. Not merely Ambedkar, but also Jayaprakash Naram. The other big subject, which is of such importance to India, then and now, is about social harmony. What is it that permits it, and how do you ensure it? According to him, according to old Aryan theory, I'm using his own words, there was no such thing as communal conflict. There was freedom of conscience. He uses the expression freedom of conscience according to old Aryan theory. Now, I cannot think of anything more unhistorical to say, because freedom of conscience is a concept that becomes available only in the 18th century, especially with the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and so on. It is certainly not meaningful to talk about it in the earlier centuries in any part of the world, not only in India. But he claimed that there was freedom of conscience, and he brashly made the claim. It was necessary for him to make the claim because that is what is required for modern Indian nationalism and secularism. That there was such freedom of conscience, there was no such conflict, and subsequent conflict was generated by the absolutism of the rulers, whoever the rulers be. So what was the impact of Islam, which is what we are coming to? This is the important issue. He rejected the periodization of Indian history into the Hindu, Muslim and British, which is a colonial version of it. He said that is an absurdity, you cannot have periods defined by religions in this way, and why can't British be called Christian, and so on. He made those points. Having rejected it, he nonetheless used the concept without the nomenclature. He didn't call it Hindu, he called it Indo-Aryan. The British, of course, is a self-defined period with a colonial conquest. Nobody would deny it. And the intervening period, he did not call it the Muslim period, but he freely talked about the Muslim conquest and Muslim invaders. He used those expressions quite often. And he claimed that many things went wrong in India from 1000 AD. Now 1000 AD is a crucial date. From there that we date the invasions, the raids of Mahmud of Ghazni, supposed beginning of the Muslim period. So, what is it that went wrong? He claimed that already things had gone wrong. India was in decline beforehand. It was losing its creative capacities already by the time Mahmud of Ghazni came. He gives no evidence as to how India had lost its creative capacities, neither in productivity, nor in social organization, nor political structures, nor technology, nor anything. It is just a declaration. And it is in a sense inferred from the fact that Mahmud of Ghazni was able to invade India so regularly and with such success. And this is done by even others in his circle, like Narendra Dev or Jayaprakash Narayan. There are no explanations as to why that should be a phase of decline. But the decline, did it begin before or only then, is not quite clear. But the suggestion is that sometime around then it all went into decline. And then, when it did so, it also had a shock effect. So on the one hand, there was a loss of energy from that time, at the same time that it had a creative impact. The creative impact is the creation of the syncretic culture. Subsequently, when whatever he called Indo-Aryan culture and of Islam, they fused and created a syncretic culture, of which the evidence he gives is the Bhakti movement and all the names that are familiar to us, and of Akbar and his experiments, things like the Deen-e-Ilahi and so on. So it was both the beginning of some sort of a decline. It is also the time of a resurgence in the form of a creative confluence of cultures. He did both, and the synthesis is available. But the point is that 1000 AD is a marking point, is a turning point of some kind. And subsequently he adds that Mahmud's raids actually created a series of negative impulses. The village ossified, village democracy ossified, the caste system petrified, women lost their liberties, and Indian intellectual life went stagnant. So all these things are happening from that date. He's coming very close to the idea of the decline caused by this so-called Muslim conquest. He doesn't quite do it that way. Now, if we are to compare his treatment of Nehru with his treatment of the Kushans 1,000 years earlier, Kanishka. Kanishka is his great hero, a Buddhist who seemed to have spent all his time debating in the Sangha, debating philosophical questions, somewhat like Harun al-Rashid and so on. It is one of those ideal personalities, the ideal king. And this just went on. But Kanishka and the Kushans, by his own record, are a Mongolian people who have invaded India and have created a great empire which stretched from Central Asia into the middle of India, covering almost exactly the same territory as Mahmud Ghazni. Same way. Ghazni is negative, Kanishka is positive. And the reason is Kanishka became Buddhist. And a Buddhism is therefore native to the soil. He is getting trapped in that sort of argumentation and that kind of thinking. Although Akbar seems to be the right man, he did everything that a Kanishka did, but not quite. Akbar seems to be a solitary figure. people before him and after him did not live up to Akbar. So Akbar is a great hope, but not the rest. So you can see Nehru is slowly getting sucked into the whirlpool here, despite himself in any way. Now, however questionable some of those judgments are, well, never mind. He does not even talk about the invasion process of the Kushans. We hear so much about the invasions by Nehru-Gandhi and his successors. But what about the Kushans? They are Central Asian people the same way, and they've invaded the same way. But we only hear of a spread of an empire. It is so anodyne, it is something like the neurological feat of the British establishment of the Indian Empire through a fit of absent-mindedness. It is Kanishka has preceded the British in that way, on the Kushans hand. He is able to pass it off that way. So there's so much wishful thinking there. Kanishka, everything went well. With Nehru, things went wrong. And it lasted a long time. Now, it might come as a bit of a surprise to see that Nehru went further into the subject in this manner. He said, unhappily, India connected Islam with the lack of civilization and the horrors of Nehru's reigns and bitterness grew. He's comparing the Arabs there. But even at such an important moment as the Lahore Congress in 1929, he's talking about the social equilibrium established by the absorptive capacity of India. India is always a claim of our nationalism that we absorb all foreign influences and we create a composite culture constantly. That is what he called an equilibrium. So in 1929, at the Lahore Congress, he's saying, with the coming of the Muslims, the equilibrium was disturbed. But India sought to restore it and largely succeeded. So far, so good. Unhappily for us, before we could adjust our differences, the political structure broke down, the British came, and we fell. Well, there are about 8 centuries from Mahmud's raids to the British conquest. So if in 8 centuries you're not able to do your job, well, how much more time do you want? Nehru is asking too much of history in this way. But the important point is he says that equilibrium was disturbed. He imagines an equilibrium and he imagines a disturbance to it that is taking place. This is the language he has used. And finally, he says, when by the 14th century some sort of a fusion occurred, that syncretic culture, the creative capacities of Indian culture was displayed, he makes this particular comment, that this is strange. The fierceness and cruelty of the early Afghan invaders and the slave kings have been toned down, and the Muslim kings are as much Indian as the Hindus. Now it sounds as if everything is okay. They're not foreigners, they've become Indian and so on. But what's he saying there? That Hindus and Buddhists are not cruel and fierce, but these Afghan and slave kings are cruel and fierce. And it's only by their fusion of India they settle down to, what shall we say, civilized politics. So it seems a bit of a condemnation of an extraordinary kind of several centuries. This is the 14th century of the Turkish and Afghan rulers. So Hindu and Buddhists are not fierce and cruel, only these are. So the contrast between the two invasions and these statements make it rather extraordinary. But there's one more interesting detail. His contrast between the Arab and the Turk. You know, he idealized Arab civilization, as I told you already. He considered them the true Muslims, the perfect Muslims. They were what Islam should be. But the Turks were not. They were semi-civilized, they were rigid, and they were militaristic. And that is the Islam which came to India. And that's his infinite regret. That the wrong Islam came to India. If the Arab one had come, life would have been But the wrong one came from Central Asia, when Islam was militaristic, rigid, and semi-civilized. That's what he talks of these people. Now, what is extraordinary about the statement is not merely that he makes this kind of a comparison, and he even suggests that if India had been conquered by the Arabs, would it have been better? That's strange for a nationalist to speculate that a foreign conquest, one foreign conquest would have been better than another foreign conquest. He actually speculates that way. But the Arabs were hardly the gentlest of conquerors. The experience of Iran shows it. For 300 years, the Persian language is not allowed in public. The Zoroastrianism was wiped out, and they found refuge in India and became the Parsis. And the whole of Central Asia, Buddhism was wiped out. In India, nothing of the kind happened. All Indian religions flourished, all Indian languages flourished, India continued as before, with all the Turkish invasions, as they're called. So it looks as if India got the better deal, finally, compared to Iran. And we did better by getting the Turks rather than the Arabs. But in Nehru's dream world, the Arabs were the superior, the better. Because he's thinking only of the Harun al-Rashid, of the Arabs of that time. But those are the very Arabs who destroyed Iran, or destroyed the then Italian culture and Buddhist culture in Central Asia. So it's all very confused and problematic there. Now let's get to the modern period, colonialism. How does he treat colonialism? It was his argument that India had been petrifying since about 1000 AD, and then the colonial shock occurred, and India revived in some way. Now, but then colonialism itself caused stagnation, and nationalism revived India. So colonialism was both a shock that revived as well as a cause of stagnation. Two contradictory processes going on at the same time, and nationalism revives India. But where does he place the cause of the conquest? Is it the Industrial Revolution in England, or is it Indian decay before the conquest? He squarely places it on the decline in India. India had ossified. It is a fault in India that God made it possible. And he has detailed accounts of ignorance and limitations and lack of knowledge even of Indian territory by Indian rulers compared to what the East India Company had about India. All that goes into. So India was in crisis, and that is what permitted this conquest to take place. And once a conquest took place, they built upon it. Because India was in that crisis, not able to take advantage even of that conquest and absorb the new impulses, till much later nationalism made it possible. So the fault lay in India. And the colonial conquest did not impart that creative process, or did not generate that creative process, which colonial apologists always claim. It is not due to colonialism that India developed subsequently, but due to industrialization itself. And this is his major point here. The Industrial Revolution was a revolution. It is not colonial. It's a revolution that is worldwide, even if it originated somewhere. It originated in West Europe, okay. But it is worldwide. And there's no state in the world which would not take to the Industrial Revolution for the sake of survival. Any state which had to survive had to industrialize. So it is a worldwide revolutionary process. It has nothing to do with colonialism. So if something dynamic occurred in India under colonialism, it's because they had imported some aspects of industrialization into India, or used some aspects of it. But, he said, they only limited it, they inhibited it. Colonialism was a hindrance to industrialization. Had India been independent, if it had followed the normal course, India would have industrialized and would not have suffered this perverted form of development that we are known today as underdevelopment and so on, and from which we have to recover after independence. So he gives no credit to colonialism to provide a creative shock to India and the subsequent development and progress and so on that is taking place, which colonial rulers always claim. He said it's industrialization pure and simple, nothing more than that. And that is why after independence, by his logic, India is able to steam ahead with industrialization. has to overcome. So this is his point about the colonial conquest. Now, where does nationalism come in this whole story after this? According to the colonial story, and I think almost common sense amongst most people, it would be said that nationalism was a reaction to colonialism, to colonial rule. Naturally, if you're ruled by a foreigner, you fight against it and you generate an ideology which we call nationalist, and that is how it originates and develops. But that goes against the grain of any nationalist. Nationalism cannot be derived from colonialism. It has to be independent and sovereign. That is what nationalists would always expect and want. And certainly that's exactly what Nehru did. So while Nehru described all the prehistory of nationalism, from Ram Mohan Roy down to the First World War, and all the social religious reform movements and so on, and the mobilization that occurred along with it, he considered it all inadequate. Real nationalism began only in the 20th century, or the national movement, which was unifying and an anti-imperialist force. That is what nationalism is. So nationalism is something that occurred without a prehistory. And he makes it very dramatic, with almost biblical import. In one sudden paragraph he says, or in one introduction to one paragraph he says, and Gandhi came. As simple and straightforward as that. Now you might think it's naive, how extraordinary. This is in the Discovery of India. In the glimpses he says, it was a small cloud that gathered on the horizon, and then it gathered, became larger and larger till it covered the skies. The same thing. He doesn't give any prehistory. There are no antecedents to nationalism in the real sense. It is self-generated, is the argument. And he dramatized it by putting it in this way, and Gandhi came. He's not actually attributing it completely personally to Gandhi. He's saying that nationalism is actually self-generated. It's not due to the British. It's not due to these earlier social religious reform movements. It's entirely generated on its own. And Gandhi is the symbol of it, the leader of it, and all his followers. Yeah. It's an extraordinary ahistorical statement, you could say, after writing four full books on history. How is that he can say that something as important as nationalism doesn't have a prehistory? There's no historical preparation for nationalism, as it were, the way he's written it. Well, in defense of Nehru, he said, he has good reason to say so. He has seen nationalism, like industrialization, as a revolutionary global process. It is not due to a prehistory. It doesn't have a prehistory. Everything can be related to something that happened before. That, of course, can always be done. You can find umpteen organizational, ideological, and other connections, but you can't explain it by something of an equivalent importance that occurred before. Neither the Industrial Revolution nor nationalism. Every state and nation, or people that aspired to be a nation, had to nationalize itself in modern times. It had to nationalize itself, it had to industrialize itself. And nationalism became the new form of solidarity in the modern world, overcoming all previous forms of solidarity, be it of religion, of tribe, of lineage, or anything else. It superseded them all. And even religions, when they choose to be nationalists, choose to claim a national pedigree or use nationalism, they have to recast themselves as nationalists. They cannot be just religious. So nationalism is now the fundamental form of solidarity across the world. It had challenges in the form of class and race, but both have fallen out of the way. It is only nationalism. And beyond nationalism, you have various forms of supranationalist bodies and internationalism and so on. So, this nationalism, if it is like the industrialization, and if the two go together, then Nehru's argument holds. There is no precedent. There are no earlier causes. It grows, is self-generated in both cases. But nationalism, being what it was, it could seek forms of solidarity in any number of ideological possibilities. It could seek it from its own history, and all nationalists do that, and Nehru did it. And I just listed those. The village democracy, the continuity of civilization, social harmony, and so on. All these are, you can use various features. Similarly, you can borrow from anywhere in the world. And Indian nationalism certainly has, Nehru himself has. The ones he has borrowed are the ideologies of liberalism, what we call now human rights, of civil, political and social rights, as elaborated from the French Revolution, the rights of man, down to the Declaration of Human Rights in the UN in 1948. Those are the rights, along with the rule of law, bureaucracy, or bureaucratic rationality, I would say, rather than just bureaucracy, and democracy. These are what he has put together, and any nationalism can absorb it as much as it chooses. It can also choose other possibilities. You've got racism, militarism, xenophobia, leadership cults, and all that is associated with fascism. So nationalism can choose combinations of these, and it has chosen. It is not dependent solely on the history. There is a misapprehension that nationalists are derived straight from the history of the last 5,000 years. That's our claim. We always talk of 5,000 years of history, Nehru himself does. That it is derived from that. No, not in the least. It is calling upon that history, it is calling upon other ideologies around the world. It is borrowed from any number of sources in precisely the manner that Nehru always says. Keep your mind open to external stimuli. That external stimuli can be the foreign country known as the past. And it can be the foreign country known as France also. All these foreign countries, your own foreign past and other foreign pasts can all come together. They're all available and you can put together a nationalism. There's always histories come full circle in this way. And finally, he has a word of caution about nationalism. Nationalism tends to be exclusive. It excludes other nationalisms naturally. It tries to be self-sufficient, and every danger, therefore, it will be closed. It will be a closed system. And it reproduces the very danger that he has worked against, and he has cautioned against, and for which he's written the whole of the glimpses of world history. That once again, after you created a nationalism which opens out into the whole of India, unites India, expels the British, you can close once again. So, one of the dangers we have to beware of is nationalism itself, from nationalism itself. It can close us. So the answer is internationalism. And that is why Nehru was such a passionate internationalist and a passionate nationalist at the same time. The one had to go with the other. You cannot exclude one or the other. If you remain only with nationalism, and he said it any number of times, you're going to get in very serious danger. And you have to be internationalist to escape this danger. And he wrote all his histories to cover these points, and you can see how they fit into each other. The human history through internationalism and the dangers of enclosure, self-enclosure that he cited throughout history, and which nationalism can also produce. We are now in the midst of it, and he's warning us against it. Thank you very much.
बहुत शुक्रिया प्रोफेसर माधव पालक, और मुझे यकीन है कि अगर नेहरू यहाँ रहते तो ज़रूर खड़े होकर माधव पालक के उनके लिखे हुए इतिहास की इस आलोचना के लिए उनको शाबाशी देते।